Well, good morning to you. It's great to see you all today. There are a few gaps, I think, in the pews. I understand there might be a youth function on somewhere that's taken some of our people away, but it's good to have you here, and you're the most important ones. Today, anyway. Here at this place. I need to qualify that a little. Today's topic of Daniel and the Greeks, and we're going to look at these words, desolation, deliverance, and restoration, as we make our way through, because they are very relevant to the book of Daniel, but they're also relevant, I think, to each one of us. Because in our lives, things happen. You know, stuff happens. Or am I the only one that stuff happens to? Seems to be too often for me. And there are others. And I know there are people here who perhaps are not here today because stuff has happened. And I'm thinking of my former roommate, David Roberts. And he's of course not able to be here. Former roommate, that's back at Longburn years ago. I'd hesitate to tell you what year that was. It was a mighty long time ago. It was in the 1950s. Wow. You think you must be old. Yep. Yep, that's right. And then there's our leading elder, Elizabeth Ostring, who had a fall, has a fracture, very painful. And our thoughts and prayers are with her as well. Life certainly can be desolating. We look for deliverance and we look for restoration. And that's all illustrated in the passages that we'll be looking at in the book of Daniel. First of all, a few facts about the book of Daniel. It was written in 2 languages. Did you know that? And English wasn't one of them. Right? Who knows what these 2 languages were? Yeah, there's a bit of a clue there on the screen, isn't there? Hebrew and Aramaic. And really there were six chapters in Hebrew and 6 in Aramaic out of the 12 chapters. Right, the first chapter and right through to chapter 2 and the middle of verse 4, it's Hebrew. And then mid-verse, that's weird, isn't it? Mid-verse, the language changes. So part B of chapter 2, verse 4, it switches to Aramaic. And it stays in Aramaic right till the end of chapter 7. And then we come to chapter 8 to 12, and that's all in Hebrew. So I don't know that we'd want to lose any sleep over that, but that's just one of the unusual things about it. It also switches between third person and first person. You know what I mean? A third person narration is that the writer is saying such and such happened to so and so. And the first 6 chapters, which are primarily Aramaic, chapter 1 is Hebrew, it's about Daniel. It's not I, Daniel, did this, that, or the other thing, but it's written in the third person, as if someone else had written it. Now, I'm not saying Daniel didn't write it, he may have done, but it's in the third person. And then chapters 7 to 12, the other half of the book, they're primarily in Hebrew. Chapter 7 is actually in Aramaic, and 8 to 12 are in Hebrew. And it's here that, in these verses, that Daniel is describing the visions that he saw. Another question that is often discussed is, when was Daniel written? And now, discussion on this can get quite heated. There are some people that say Daniel was written back in the 6th century, that the book was written when Daniel lived, and there are others that are saying, no, it was written later about things that happened in the 6th century. Now, the Adventist Church has consistently been on what we call the traditional side of things, where it's a 6th century book written in the 6th century, and that is supported by the internal dating within the book. The more modern view, which frankly I reject totally, is that it was written in the 2nd century BC. Now, the convenient thing about having it written in the 2nd century BC is that instead of being prophecy, it's history. And that kind of doesn't go down well with me. But then there's the other view. There's yet another view that although the book as it is today dates from the 2nd century, it was compiled from earlier documents written by Daniel himself in the 6th century. You see what's happening here? Here's a suggestion that it's a collection of documents that were written over many years, and they were. There's probably a span of close to 70 years between when Daniel 1 and 2 were written and the later visions of Daniel. And we're familiar with that within our own church, because we know, for example, that the Ellen White estate continued to put out books written by Ellen White even after she died. And they compiled these books from things that she had written during her lifetime. And here's a suggestion that something like that may happen. We can't be dogmatic about that, but that may explain some of the things or characteristics that we find in the book of Daniel. One of the questions that is addressed, in fact, one of the claims that is made by those who support the 6th century authorship, you notice you count backwards. So the 2nd century is more recent than the 6th, right? Because these are centuries before the time of Christ. And there are words, or are there words, that's the claim that is made, are there words in Aramaic or Hebrew that were not used in the 2nd century? And some people have been able to do that. They've been able to roll out, say, here are some words, some expressions and so on in the original languages, either the Aramaic or the Hebrew. They weren't even used, those words. They hadn't heard of those words in the 2nd century, so it must be written in the 6th. So, good question to answer, do you think, or to ask? The answer is yes, as you might imagine. But now let's flip that question on its head. Does Daniel contain Aramaic or Hebrew words that were not used in the 6th century? It's the opposite question. Who knows the answer? Did I hear a yes? Yeah, you're right. So one sort of cancels the other out, doesn't it? So we still have this conundrum in a way. Here's a quote from an Adventist writer. He said, "My personal opinion is that the book consists of personal and private documents left by Daniel, but assembled later." That's a process like we described as happened with the E.G. White estate. So documents written over a long period of time, but assembled by someone else later. And maybe that happened in the 2nd century. It might have been before the 2nd century, but certainly after the time of Daniel. And that would explain why there are words and phrases that are unique to the 6th century. You know how language changes over time. And there are also words and phrases that are unique to the 2nd century, all in the same book. That quote I read from an Adventist is this fellow. He's quite a young man, as you can see. Lived many, many years ago. George Macready Price. Any of you heard of him? Nobody heard of him? Yes, Warwick has, certainly. He wrote a commentary on the book of Daniel called The Greatest of the Prophets. It's the commentary on Daniel that I've spent most time in. There are other commentaries of Daniel, Uriah Smith going way back to the pioneers. And this man goes back pretty much to the pioneers anyway. He was born in 1870 in Canada, in New Brunswick. His mother was a Seventh-day Baptist and was converted to Seventh-day Adventism. His father died when he was 12. They were trying to keep the farm together. He had a brother who worked on the farm as well. But in 1891, young Price, at the age of 21, went and enrolled at Battle Creek College. Ever heard of Battle Creek College? We're getting a bit of history here today, denominational history. Battle Creek was a very famous location. Anyone been to Battle Creek? Yeah, I can see a few hands. Yeah, I've been there too. And it's not a big centre, but it was an important place for the genesis, if I can use that word, of our denomination. And it was founded in 1874, so it had been going a few years when young Price enrolled. It's now called Andrews University, but it's not at Battle Creek. No. Okay, it's about 80 miles distant at Berrien Springs. And I've been there as well, as some of you have. Macready Price taught Bible and science in Adventist colleges right through to his retirement in the year 1938. He was 68 by then. Quite a remarkable man. He was working at Walla Walla College on the west coast when he retired, and then he retired to Loma Linda. This man was famous outside of our church as well as inside it, because he wrote about 25 books on creation versus evolution. Have you heard about the monkey trial, the Scopes trial? You heard about that? There was a I think it was in the state of Texas. There was a teacher called Scopes, and in those days it was against the law to teach evolution. And I see a couple of heads nodding, and there's a court case held, and the guy that put the creation story was a fellow who'd run for president a number of times, William Jennings Bryan. But the interesting thing is that Bryan used Price's material in that case, which unfortunately was lost. But he was a very, very well respected and well known outside of our church as well as inside it. The reason I've mentioned that is the sermon's not about Price, obviously, but I'm going to refer to a number of quotes that he's made as we proceed. All right, question for you. We know that Daniel had a lot of dreams. Which was the first one? Who's bold enough to say which was the first vision that Daniel had? No, I can hear people chatting, but I can't hear what you're saying, and that's not surprising. Were you thinking of the man with the head of gold and the chest and arms of silver? You know, that, of course, was Nebuchadnezzar's dream. Okay. Daniel's first vision, in fact, is Daniel chapter 7. It's in Aramaic. It's the last Aramaic chapter in the book, and it was written about 50 years after Nebuchadnezzar's dream. So, and it's set in Babylon in the first year of Belshazzar. Why do we remember Belshazzar? The writing on the wall. Thank you, Jordana. Yes, the writing on the wall. Thou art found wanting. And of course, this was the fall of Babylon to who? The Medo-Persia, yeah. And this procession of nations was represented initially to Nebuchadnezzar, the head of gold, chest and arms of silver, belly and thighs brass, legs of iron, feet of iron, and clay, and of course the 10 toes. Now this vision covers the same territory, plus a little bit. The lion represents Babylon, the bear, Medo-Persia, raised up on one side, one of them being stronger than the other, 3 ribs in its mouth. What's that about? Yeah, they destroyed three kingdoms coming to power. And then there's this leopard with 4 heads on it and wings. And it's very easy to think, well, who was that? Oh, that was Greece. And Greece, of course, it had its first king who was very, very prominent. He died quite young, and he was replaced by 4 generals. And these 4 generals were really in charge until along came Rome, the 4th of these kingdoms. Is that right? And this Roman kingdom, this beast, sort of didn't resemble anything in the zoo. Quite different. Had 10 horns, and in fact, amongst those horns, another one shot up and it became very bold and spoke great things and so on. And we know that this refers to what's called the little horn of Daniel 7, and we apply that to a power coming up after imperial Rome, which are represented by the nondescript beast, and this power coming up after imperial Rome spoke with a big mouth and great things and so on, and we say, well, that's the Antichrist. Some say papal Rome. The Reformers said papal Rome. Adventists have said that forever, and there's good reason for doing so. So that's Daniel 7. Now, let's move on to his second vision, and this is in Daniel 8, and it's a bit different. It only has two animals. They're the kind of animals that you're allowed to eat according to Leviticus, whereas the previous ones you weren't allowed to have them. You can't have a feed of lion or leopard or so on, but you could eat these. These animals were also used in the sacrificial systems, and they're vegetarian. We have a ram and a he-goat. Now, this vision was written in the 3rd year of Belshazzar. That's his last year. That's the year that he did see the writing on the wall. It's set in a place called Shushan. It's written Hebrew, of course, not Aramaic. Shushan in Iran, or sometimes called Susa, and that's 362 kilometres to the east of Babylon, right on the edge of Medo-Persia. It was a summer palace for the Babylonian kings, and Daniel, whether he was there physically or in vision, we can't be certain about that, but that's the setting. So it's quite a different setting, different animals, different language, and written 2.5, maybe 3 years after Daniel 7. Then we have his third vision, and this is Daniel chapter 9. And that one was written 15 years after Daniel 7, or you might say 13 years after Daniel 8. It was written in the 1st year of Darius the Mede, 538 BC. And it's a remarkable prophecy. We could spend our whole time on this, even on this slide, but I'm not going to do that. Maybe sometime in the future, because I've promised to talk about something else today. But this is quite remarkable. It's the exact expression was 77s. You know how the Jewish people had 7-year blocks? 7 years and the crops got a rest, and 7 years and slaves got freed, and so on. And here the angel tells Daniel there'll be 70 lots of these 7-year periods, which adds up to how long? 490, doesn't it? 77s, 490 years. And it took us through to, well, I've highlighted to atone for wickedness. When was the atonement for wickedness made? Wasn't it the cross? And so this prophecy, at least understood in this way, points us to the cross of Christ. And that's a wonderful thing, to seal up the vision, to anoint the most holy, and to make atonement for sins. But I promised to talk about Daniel and the Greeks. Now, none of Daniel is written in the Greek language, unless, of course, you're reading the Septuagint version of the Old Testament, which is a Greek translation. But Greek features very strongly, the Greeks feature very strongly, particularly in Daniel 8 and through to the end of the chapter, the rest of the book. They appear in the second vision, and they also appear in his fourth vision. You might like to open up your Bibles, because it's in Daniel chapter 8, and we're going to spend a bit of time here. In Daniel chapter 8, we have an explanation as to who these beasts represent. In Daniel 7, we don't get that. In Daniel 2, we only get it for the first. Thou art this head of gold. After you will arise other nations, and they're represented by different metals, but they're not identified. We only know who they were by looking back. The same thing with Daniel 7. You've got the succession of beasts, but they're not labelled. You come to Daniel 8, now we're getting more specific. In Daniel 8, verses 20 and 21, talks about the two-horned ram that you saw represents the kings of Media and Persia. And the shaggy goat is the king of Greece. And the large horn between his eyes is the first king. So not a lot of guesswork needed here. We know who these represents, or who these animals represent. Who was the first king of Greece, by the way? Who knows? How's your history today? Did somebody say Alexander the Great? Spot on. Yes, first king of Greece, Alexander the Great. What do we know about this fellow? He was the son of Philip II of Macedon, the son of Philip of Macedon. Macedonia was a small kingdom. When Alexander was 13 years old, he was tutored, as his dad arranged, for the philosopher Aristotle. You've heard of Aristotle? Famous Greek. And he was the tutor for Alexander the Great. At the age of 18, he became a cavalry commander. He was a military man. And when he was 20, his father was assassinated by a political opponent. And Alexander had to fight to be the successor of his father. And he campaigned consistently for 15 years. And it's said that he never lost a battle. That's some record, isn't it? He established the Greek Empire, and that became the largest empire the ancient world had ever seen. And then he died in 323 BC in Babylon, quite possibly of malaria. Now, I don't know how much of that you can see, but I'll just see if I can point. I can, yeah. Okay, so there's Macedonia. That's where he came from, up here. One of the early battles was this one, and that's where he met Darius III. He was the king of Media Persia. In fact, they ruled the whole thing. The army of Darius had 6 soldiers to every one of Alexander's. And Alexander and his men won. Darius fled. He tried to do a deal. He said, I'll give you the half of the kingdom, this side of the Euphrates, if we can make peace. Alexander chased him. He chased him down here. Went to a place called Tyre, Sidon, Gaza. Ever heard of that? They have a few wars there over the years. Jerusalem. Went across here to Alexandria. In fact, he established Alexandria. That's named, of course, after Alexander the Great. And then after that, he went back through Memphis, across here to this city. Some of these names are not easier to say. Gargamel. That was a decisive battle. That was where Darius III decided it was too much and he fled. And his own men assassinated him. And now, with Darius gone, Alexander had it all to himself. And he then progressed right across to the east. This battle here, this is in the Punjab. It was in India, now I think it's a province of Pakistan. That was a big battle with the Indians. And there was a difference here because the Indians had elephants. Now that was a different dimension if you're going to war and your enemy's got elephants. And apparently it was in a thunderstorm. Anyhow, and outnumbered, and yet Alexander and his men won. However, his men got a bit sick of all of this. They'd been going for 15 years. And they made their way back to Babylon. And there in Babylon, Alexander died. Just backing up a little bit, we mentioned the trip down to Tyre, the Battle of Tyre. That was in January 332 BC. Alexander sieged that city. It was a heavily fortified island. It used to be an island back in those days. And you can see a causeway here called Mole Number 1. Alexander got his men to build that so they could get to Tyre. When they got there, they were defeated. Now, we said he'd never lost a battle, but, he was defeated there because he didn't have a navy. So what he did was he got a navy. They built ships, and eventually they came and took Tyre. And you can read about it in Ezekiel chapter 26, verses 4 to 6, where Tyre was to be scraped like the top of a rock. That would be a place for fishermen to leave their nets. And that prophecy was literally fulfilled. From there, Alexander went on to Jerusalem. Well, he went to Gaza and then he went to Jerusalem. Now, the account of what happened in Jerusalem isn't in the Bible. So we need to look to secular history to find out what happened there. And here's a quote from Josephus. Now, Josephus was a Jewish historian. He lived from the year 37 to 100 AD. So that was his lifetime. So he was born just a few years after the crucifixion, 4 years after the crucifixion of Jesus. And he was alive, of course, during the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. And Josephus has written this, it's translated, of course, 200 years before Alexander, Daniel wrote, "He will establish himself in the beautiful land." And that's a quote from Daniel 11 and verse 16. After receiving a vision, Josephus wrote, Judas, the high priest, went out to meet the army of Alexander. Imagine that, unarmed, dressed in their priestly robes, and they went out to meet this ferocious contender. When Alexander saw Judas dressed in the robes of the high priest and a gold plate engraved with Yahweh, that's the name of God, he approached by himself and adored that name, and he saluted the high priest. Now, Alexander's men were amazed, and they asked him to explain what's going on here. They were ready for a fight. They were ready to wipe out these Jewish people. Alexander replied, "When I was in Macedonia," this is way back, right, when he inherited from his dad, "considering how I could become master of Asia." Quite an ambitious fellow, wasn't he? "I saw this very person in my sleep, dressed as he is now. He urged me not to delay, but to cross over confidently and take dominion over the Persians." So what happened? Much to the delight of the Jews, and I'm quoting here, I'm reading from a historical article, Alexander proceeded to Jerusalem and offered sacrifices to the Jewish temple. When the book of Daniel was shown to him, which predicted that one of the Greeks would destroy the Persian Empire, he thought himself to be the one so designated. When he offered the Jews whatever they desired, the high priest asked that they might observe their laws and be exempt from the tribute every 7th year. Here we have one of these blocks of 7 years. Alexander granted these requests. They further asked that the Jews in Babylon and Media be allowed their laws, and he also agreed. Amazing, isn't it? Let's come back to the Bible. Back to Daniel chapter 8, and now verse 8. It says, "The goat became very great." The goat was Alexander the Great. Well, he was a prominent horn. He was the goat, the greatest of all time, right? And he became very great. But at the height of its power, the large horn was broken off. And in its place, 4 prominent horns grew up toward the 4 winds of heaven. And so we have the names of these generals who inherited and fought among themselves after the death of Alexander. Seleucus was Syrians, Ptolemy, Egypt. Here we have the king of the north and the king of the south. and the others sort of became less important as time went on. But now in verse 9 we read, out of one of them came a little horn. Who's the them? Got to be the four horns, right? Clearly. Out of one of them came a little horn. It started small but grew in power to the south and the east and toward the beautiful land. And if you're reading in your Bibles, I'd like you to count the number of times you find the word daily sacrifice, or just daily. It took away the daily sacrifice from the Lord, and his sanctuary was thrown down. Because of rebellion, the Lord's people and the daily sacrifice were given over to it. So this little horn wasn't friendly like Alexander the Great had been. He was quite the opposite. He now attacked their worship rather than admiring their worship, as Alexander the Great had done. And this character indeed opposed it, opposed the daily sacrifice, took away the daily sacrifice. Let's see. Question, a very obvious one. Do the little horns of Daniel 7 and Daniel 8 symbolize the same power? What do you think? I think I saw someone mouthing no. All right, well, in Daniel 7, the fourth beast has 10 horns, as we mentioned later, and then another horn that uproots 3 of the 10. And then another so-called little horn, gets very big, comes up after them. And this points to the something that happened after the division of Rome into the 10 kingdoms, pagan Rome or imperial Rome, and it's often identified with the Antichrist. Now, this beast is very similar to the character in Revelation chapter 13, verses 1 and 2, where we have one beast, and in fact, it might pay to have a look at that, Revelation 13 and verses 1 and 2. Yeah, here we are. And I saw a beast coming up out of the sea. He had 10 horns and 7 heads, with 10 crowns on his horns, and on each head a blasphemous name. The beast I saw resembled a leopard, but had feet like those of a bear and a mouth like that of a lion. So here's this one composite beast, and it sort of has the characteristics of the 4 beasts of Daniel 7, but they're stated in reverse order, right? So you got the leopard, the bear, the lion, rather than the lion, the bear, the leopard. Interesting. In Daniel 8, as we've seen, the little horn emerges from the 4 horns representing the 4 successors of Alexander the Great. Therefore, the little horn in Daniel 8 represents a leader who would come out of one of the divisions of Alexander's empire. That's clear. To deny that, you'd have to argue with the Bible, because Daniel 8, verse 9, states that exactly. And there is no 4th beast in Daniel 8. So what's happening here? As I see it, Daniel is focusing on the Greek period. He's given us the big picture in Daniel 7, right? Babylon, Media, Persia, Greece, Rome, the 10 kingdoms that would arise from Rome, the little horn, predicting both the imperial and papal power, and the final Antichrist. Now in chapter 8, he focuses on the Greek period. And that's why I've given this the title of Daniel and the Greeks. Here's a more recent study, 2013. In Daniel 8, verses 21 to 22, the Archangel Gabriel informs Daniel that the male goat represents the kingdom of Greece. Thus, the king represented by the little horn in Daniel 8, verse 9, emerges out of the Greek empire. I think we made that pretty clear. It goes on to say the little horn of chapter 7 and the one of chapter 8 are thus not referring to the same person, but two different individuals. Now that may come as a surprise to you, and you may not even want to believe it, but it looks pretty clear that that is the case. So who is this little horn of Daniel 8 and verse 9? We've identified the little horn of Daniel 7 already a couple of times. Well, some say it's the same, imperial and papal Rome. Others say it's this character called Antiochus IV Epiphanes. You've heard of him? Okay, most scholars say that the little horn of Daniel 8 represents Antiochus. He was a Greek king who persecuted the Jews and desecrated the second temple in Jerusalem. The first temple was Solomon's temple. The second temple was the one that was built after the captives who were taken into Babylon went back to their homeland. Now back to George Macready Price, this man who taught Bible during the lifetime of Ellen White. Antiochus attempted to revise the Jewish calendar and tried to make the Jews profane the Sabbath. Antiochus may well be regarded as a preliminary type of a later, greater Antichrist. For this is exactly what Rome has been doing for centuries and on a global scale. So coming back to that previous slide just very quickly, if I can. No, I won't bother, I don't think. Yeah, here we go. Who is the little horn of Daniel 8? There's the traditional explanation that we have held to as Adventists, that it's Imperial Rome and then the Antichrist. And we've thought we were in a fight with those who said it was Antiochus IV. And we are, unless we see Antiochus as a type of a later Antichrist. And that was the position that George Macready Price, took all those years ago. We've heard it since, but I hadn't heard it. I think that's the oldest I can see in our history. Now let's come on to Daniel 8 and verse 13, because this asks a question about the daily sacrifice. Did anyone count how many times you saw the daily sacrifice in Daniel 8? Okay, might have been 3 or 4. In verse 13, a question is asked, how long shall be the vision concerning the daily sacrifice and the transgression of desolation to give both sanctuary and the host to be trodden underfoot? And the answer was, unto 2,300 days, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. Or in the English Standard Version, it says for 2,300 evenings and mornings. Then shall the sanctuary be restored to its rightful state. Or if we come to the New International Version, again, 2,300 evenings and mornings, then will the sanctuary be reconsecrated. So let's focus on the words I've highlighted in yellow for just a couple of minutes. The daily sacrifice, days, and cleansed. The daily sacrifice, it was a burnt offering of 2 lambs, a year old, was sacrificed every day in the name of the whole congregation upon the great altar. The first at dawn and the second in the evening, and together they were called the daily sacrifice. And in chapter 11 and verse 31, there the destruction or the stopping of the daily sacrifice was called the abomination that causes desolation. So why did the sanctuary need to be cleansed or restored or reconsecrated? Well, here's one explanation. The sanctuary was defiled by Antiochus, who set up the abomination of desolation and persecuted the Jewish people. He sacrificed pigs on the altar, and he issued a death decree for keeping the Sabbath, for mothers circumcising their boys. It was fatal if you got caught. There was an uprising among the Jews, eventually led to a rededication of the temple, and in fact to the celebration called Hanukkah, which the Jews still observe to this day. And in fact, you can read in John chapter 10, verses 22 and 23, that Jesus visited the temple on the Festival of Lights, or Hanukkah, same thing. Here's a bit of information from the cleansing of the sanctuary and the abomination from the 2nd century. This was written in the 2nd century. It's in the book of 1st Maccabees, which is part of some Bibles. It's part of what we call the Apocrypha. Then said Judas Maccabees to his brother, Judas was the leader of this revolt, "Behold, our enemies are crushed. Let us go up and cleanse the sanctuary and dedicate it." They saw the sanctuary desolate, the altar profaned, and the gates burned. Then Judas detailed men to fight against those in the citadel until he had cleansed the sanctuary. He chose blameless priests devoted to the law, and they cleansed the sanctuary and removed the defiled stones and so on. And then someone came, and this last bit is chapter 6, 1st Maccabees. Someone is now talking to Antiochus. Antiochus is in Persia, and told him that the armies had gone to settle this rebellion in Judea and had been routed. He's told that they, that is the Maccabeans, had torn down the abomination which he had erected upon the altar in Jerusalem. Josephus, we mentioned him before. He said the temple was made desolate by Antiochus, and so continued for 3 years. And this desolation came to pass according to the prophecy of Daniel, which was given 480 years before. Judas Maccabeus, who led the Jews in the retaking of Jerusalem, celebrated a festival for 8 days. And from that time to this, we celebrate this festival and call it Lights. And as we mentioned, that is Hanukkah today. So a quick summary then of the initial application of Daniel 8, because I certainly don't go along with those who say it referred to Antiochus, full stop. Now, what you think is up to you, obviously. I'm just giving you my opinion here. I believe there is successive fulfillments. But just to summarise what happened, the desecration of the temple in Jerusalem by erecting an altar to Zeus and sacrificing pigs on it. They banned Jewish practices, as we mentioned before, persecuted Judaism, and was punishable by death to practice the Jewish religion. They enforced Hellenization or Greek religion because Antiochus thought himself as a god king. They plundered the temple to finance military campaigns, and this led, as we said, to the Maccabean revolt. Now, verse 13 of chapter 8 said, well, how long is this going to go on? And the phrase there is in Hebrew, Erev Berga. It's translated as days in the KJV. Literally, it means evening morning. So a question here is, do 2,300 evening mornings add up to 1,150 days or 2,300? Well, take your pick. It could be either. 1,150 days, or about 3.5 years, or 2,300 days, about 7 years, if we're taking literal days. He desecrated the temple in December 167 BC by sacrificing a pig to Zeus. The temple and the altar were cleansed and used again 164 BC. That's 7 years after Onias III, the high priest, was deposed, just over 3 years after the temple was desecrated. Now you might say, sure, that's approximately either 7 years or 3.5, that's fine, but it's not exact. True. Say something more about that as we go on. The question for us as Adventists is, how do we get to October 22, 1844, out of these verses? Well, the simple answer is William Miller assumed the sanctuary is the earth, and he assumed cleansed meant the second coming of Christ. The Seventh-day Adventist pioneers assumed the sanctuary referred to the sanctuary in heaven. Not this earth, but sanctuary in heaven, and that cleansed referred to the heavenly sanctuary's Day of Atonement. Our pioneers also assumed that 2300 days represented years, and they went to Numbers 14:34 and Ezekiel 4:6, where in fact a day represents a year. And then, of course, starting at Artaxerxes' 457 BC decree, they just did their maths, and they came to October 22, 1844. So what we have here is a reinterpretation, or an interpretation, put it whichever way you like, of the literal intent of Daniel. Is that valid? It's something that was discussed when I was doing my studies at Wolsey Hall, Oxford. And we said, well, can you have successive fulfillments? So it means one thing initially and it can mean something else later. And the discussion said, yes, so long as an inspired author endorses it. And they were thinking, of course, of this prophecy being applied by Jesus to the destruction of Jerusalem later on, and various other Old Testament prophecies reapplied by New Testament writers and people, including Jesus himself, in a way that you read the initial prophecy and you wouldn't get that out of it. But they did. So it became reapplied, re-understood. So it seems to me, and again, this is just my opinion, that we have a path to say, yes, we want to keep this 1844 thing, but we've got to go to Ellen White to support it. Because I can't support it from the Bible. Can we support her from the Bible? That's another big question. I think the answer is yes. But that's not our topic today. We might have to talk about that some other time. Time's got away, so I won't dwell on these texts from Numbers and Ezekiel, except to say that neither of those passages refers to Daniel or mentions Daniel. There's no natural connection between those passages and Daniel. So Adventists traditionally have jumped from Daniel 8:14 to Leviticus 16 based on the word cleansed. What William Miller had, he had a Bible in a concordance. Oh, cleansed. Where else was cleansed pop up? Oh, it's there in Leviticus. What does that talk about? Oh, it talks about the cleansing of the sanctuary. Oh, maybe it's the cleansing of the heavenly one. And so that was the line of reasoning that got to it, rather than strict exegesis of what does the Bible actually say. I might skip over this as well, maybe not. But the word cleanse isn't there. The Hebrew word isn't cleanse. The Hebrew word used in Daniel 8:14 is not found anywhere in Leviticus 16, and that's true. The King James translators borrowed from the Septuagint Old Testament translation, which was done in the 2nd century BC, believing that verse 14 referred to the cleansing of the temple after Antiochus in December 164. This just looks at the meaning of the Hebrew words, which supports what was said there. Then we come to the question, well, who or what defiled the sanctuary? Daniel 8 refers to a wicked power defiling the sanctuary, whereas in our understanding we say it's the sins of the saints that defile the sanctuary. And the sanctuary has to be cleansed of the record of the sins. And the question is asked, how long will this wicked power defile the sanctuary? That's Daniel 8:13. And the until 1844 answer has to ignore the immediate context, forgets the sins of the wicked power, because we're saying it's the saints that are being checked up on in the investigative judgment, not the wicked power, not the wicked. In fact, Great Controversy specifically says they're dealt with later, at a different time. So is there an answer to this? I don't know if you've come across this word apotelesmatic. It's a beauty, isn't it? Okay. And it is used by George Macready Price. Now, I'm sure it was used earlier, and it's certainly been used later. But what it means is a partial or preliminary fulfillment may take place in one age, and then long afterwards, a much more complete fulfillment. Price goes on to say, the work of the little horn of Daniel 8 might be said to have been partially and imperfectly fulfilled in the interference of Antiochus Epiphanes with the sanctuary service of the Jews. Now, he's being a bit cautious here in his language. It may be. Okay, I think he's right. Jesus, of course, Matthew 24, talked about the abomination of desolation, so he's quoting from Daniel, and he was saying things like, when you see the abomination of desolation, get out of Jerusalem. Luke was more specific. He said in chapter 21, when you see Jerusalem compassed with armies, then know the desolation is nigh. So here we have Jesus quoting from Daniel 8 and from Daniel 11. We also have Revelation 13 predicting a future malevolent power. And Paul, of course, wrote about the man of lawlessness that would arise. Well, to sum it all up, and I know we're almost out of time, the book of Daniel says a lot about Greece, but what have we learned? We've learned that it identifies the first king, Alexander the Great, and his successors, including an evil oppressor who is often identified as Antiochus IV. I say often identified as Antiochus Epiphanes because not everybody agrees with that. Antiochus is a type of a later Antichrist that arises and is judged at the end of time. Later oppressors are identified as Imperial Rome and a last days tyrant who will oppose genuine worship of God. Why have I shared all this with you? Well, people who have either left the church or want to oppose our denomination will be bringing out this sort of stuff. And we need to know the answers. My view is that, yes, Antiochus is there, but that's not the end of the story. For me to argue that Antiochus is not there, like many of our people have, would be to try to argue that black is white. The history just doesn't support that. But then there's this principle of successive fulfillments. And the Bible does support that. Jesus himself did it, because when Jesus was applying Daniel 8 and 11 to the destruction of Jerusalem, what was he also talking about? Matthew 24, he's talking about the second coming, wasn't he? So he gave it a double fulfillment, even then at that time. Coming back to these key words, desolation, deliverance, and restoration. In the year 605, we're looking at Daniel's own experience, Daniel and his companions were exiled to Babylon, and Solomon's temple was destroyed. In 538 BC, Cyrus the Great issued an edict allowing the Jews to return to Jerusalem, and by 516 BC, the temple was completed. Then in 457 BC, there's that decree of Artaxerxes, which we like to start the 70 weeks prophecy on. Artaxerxes commissioned Ezra to lead a group of Jews to Judea to restore proper temple worship. And this, of course, is, 80-odd years after deliverance from Cyrus. If we look at the Greek oppression, we could see desolation in the work that Antiochus did. We see deliverance in the Jewish rebellion led by the Maccabees. And then we see restoration 7 years after Antiochus had the high priest Onias III killed. And just over 3 years after the temple was desecrated, the temple and the altar were cleansed and used again. We could apply it as Jesus did to Imperial Rome. There was the desolation in AD 70, where the Romans destroyed Jerusalem, In the second temple, they looted its sacred contents. The city was destroyed. By the way, I haven't found a way to apply the time frame to this interpretation either. How do you fit 2,300 or 1150 days, either one, into AD 70? No way. So maybe that's not the key issue. Maybe the key issue is the fact that an evil powers, a succession of evil powers were predicted to do stuff that was against God's plans. Deliverance came when Jesus said, here's the way out. And in fact, he is the way out. And restoration comes with his promise of his return, his second advent. We could also apply it to the future Antichrist, the end of time, what may lie ahead for you and me. Because Daniel's visions all lead ultimately to the judgment and downfall of the Antichrist. And deliverance, well, they triumphed over him by the blood of the Lamb, by the word of their testimony, and did not love their lives so much as to shrink from death. And restoration, well, we can go back to Daniel chapter 2. The God of heaven will set up a kingdom which will never be destroyed. And finally, there's our personal experience. Scriptures say clearly we have all sinned. That leaves us in a desolate place. Romans 5 verse 6, Christ died for the ungodly. He died for me, I'm ungodly enough. He died for me. And restoration, John 14 verse 3, he said, I will come again. Isn't that something to look forward to? And that's the big picture I see, not only in Daniel, but in the whole scriptures. We've all sinned. Christ died for the ungodly, and he's come again to receive us unto himself, that where I am, there ye may be also.
Thank you again, Peter, for sharing that message, what feels like a whole semester of denominational history and prophecy. But it answers the questions of the fundamental questions of our existence, who we are, where do we come from. Church, please rise. Let's take a peek into where we are going and sing with us, Guide Me, O Thou Jehovah, Great Jehovah.
Now, O great Jehovah, pilgrim through this barren land. I am weak, but thou art mighty. Hold me with thy powerful hand. Bread of heaven, feed me till I want no more. Feed me till I want no more. Open now the crystal fountain, whence the healing stream doth flow. Let the fire and cloudy pillar lead me home my journey through. Strong deliverer, be thou still my strength and shield. Be thou still my strength and shield. When I tread the verge of Jordan, bid my anxious fears subside. give to thee. I will ever give to thee.
Our loving Heavenly Father, we bow before you today, grateful for what you have done, grateful for the cross, grateful for the deliverance that you have provided for us from our lives, which without you would be so desolate. And we look forward to the restoration that you have promised in the new home that you have gone to prepare for us. This is our prayer in Jesus' name. Amen.
Remembering our elders and prayer warriors will be with you to serve in prayer at the back corner next to the sound desk, and we remind everyone to exit the sanctuary quietly to give them that time to pray. Thank you. Happy Sabbath, church.